Greetings, dear subscribers and casual listeners of my channel. The films about Harry Potter gifted us a magical world, but they couldn't capture every detail hidden in the books. One character who was unfairly overlooked is Professor Flitwick. Today, I'll tell you about aspects of his life that only readers of the books truly know. Make yourself comfortable. Enjoy the video. Number 1. He questioned the Grey Lady about Ravenclaw's diadem. As a Ravenclaw alumnus, Flitwick, like many students, was intrigued by the legend of the lost diadem said to grant wisdom. According to the books, the professor approached the Grey Lady, Ravenclaw's ghost, with questions about the relic's whereabouts. Dumbledore did the same, but Helena Ravenclaw refused to help either of them. She revealed the truth to only 2 people, Tom Riddle and Harry Potter. Number 2. He enchanted Hogwarts doors against Sirius Black. When Sirius Black escaped from Azkaban, it was Flitwick who placed protective enchantments on the entrance doors to Hogwarts. The task was simple: keep the fugitive out. But no one knew Sirius was an animagus. The professor's spells proved ineffective. Black bypassed the defenses and infiltrated the school, spreading panic. Number 3. He preserved part of Fred and George's swamp. During Umbridge's reign, in Order of the Phoenix, the Weasley twins staged a spectacular protest. They flooded a corridor with a magical swamp. After Umbridge's departure, Flitwick removed the spell, but not entirely. He left a small section of the swamp roped off and untouched, a monument to mischief and freedom. Number 4. He was a dueling club champion. When the dueling club was introduced in Chamber of Secrets, Hermione mentioned that Flitwick had once been a champion, and that says a lot. The charms professor wasn't just a theorist. He mastered the art of magical dueling. He was a true expert. Number 5. He wasn't a member of the Order of the Phoenix. Though Flitwick fought Voldemort in the First Wizarding War and supported Dumbledore, he was never a member of the Order, not in the books nor in the films. Perhaps he saw his main duty as protecting Hogwarts and its students. That didn't stop him from being one of the school's most reliable allies. Number 6. He had a relationship with Professor Sprout. In the commemorative edition of the Hufflepuff House book, an interesting fact was revealed. Flitwick and Professor Sprout once had a romantic relationship. They eventually broke up, but remained close friends. 2 cheerful, kind-hearted teachers, connected by more than just work. Number 7. He almost ended up in Gryffindor. Although he became Ravenclaw's head of house, Flitwick came very close. The Sorting Hat spent a long time deciding between that house and Gryffindor. In the end, Ravenclaw was chosen, but the mere fact reveals the professor's bravery and strength of spirit. Number 8. He fought Snape. In the film, we see McGonagall duel Snape, but in the book she was joined by other teachers, including Professor Flitwick. During the Battle of Hogwarts, he used a spell to animate the suits of armor to stop Snape. In that moment, the professors united against evil, each showing their courage. Number 9. Comforted Professor Trelawney after her humiliation. When Dolores Umbridge tried to evict Professor Trelawney from Hogwarts in Order of the Phoenix, the scene was brutal. Students gathered in shock as the divination teacher sobbed on the steps, her belongings scattered, her voice shaking with confusion. Most professors stood at a distance. Some were silent, but not Flitwick. The tiny charms master hurried through the crowd, clutching a handkerchief, and helped gather her things. He didn't say much. He didn't have to. Rowling writes, Professor Flitwick scurried forward and handed her a box of sherry bottles with a sympathetic look. It was such a small moment, easy to miss, but it meant the world. In that act, he gave Trelawney more than comfort. He gave her dignity. While others hesitated, Flitwick offered kindness. No performance, no speeches, just quiet empathy. That's the kind of magic he practiced best. Number 10. His high-pitched voice was mentioned in the books, too. Professor Flitwick's voice was as much a part of him as his wand. In the films it was high and a little squeaky, often softened by his cheerful tone. But readers of the books know that this wasn't just a cinematic choice. J.K. Rowling describes his voice as tiny and squeaky more than once. During stressful times, like exam season, it became even higher. In Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, when the OWL exams approached, Rowling writes, Professor Flitwick squeaked hysterically at anyone who forgot to bring a quill. His panic made some students giggle, even as they rushed to obey. But that voice also carried warmth. It lightened the mood in tense moments. Even when he was worried, there was something oddly comforting in the way his high-pitched words bounced through the classroom. When Hermione raised her hand too eagerly, or when Ron dropped a quill mid-spell, Flitwick's voice would rise like a fluttering bird, always sharp, but never cruel. It was a sound that filled the room with magic, not just from spells, but from the presence of a teacher who cared more than he let on. Number 11 saved students from enchanted traps during the 6th year. The danger crept in quietly during Harry's 6th year. Not all attacks screamed with green light. Some came hidden, inside a cursed necklace, a poisoned bottle, or an ordinary cabinet waiting to betray the school. While the Order of the Phoenix worked outside Hogwarts, inside, it was people like Professor Flitwick who kept students safe. He didn't wear robes of a resistance fighter. He wore teaching robes, but make no mistake, he was on the front line. When Katie Bell touched the cursed opal necklace, it was Flitwick who examined the magic woven into it. He recognized the nature of the enchantment immediately. Deadly, dark. It's a very old, very powerful curse, he told McGonagall, his voice unusually serious. He didn't panic, he acted. Quickly and precisely he traced the magical residues, worked to seal the object, and ordered stronger protections around the castle's entry points. Later, when Ron Weasley collapsed after drinking poisoned mead meant for Dumbledore, Flitwick was one of the first to respond. He assisted Madame Pomfrey in stabilizing Ron's condition and examined the bottle. His spells revealed layers of tampering, subtle hexwork that only a master of charms could recognize. "Someone wants Dumbledore dead," he told Sprout afterward, eyes grim behind his spectacles. He knew what they were facing, and he didn't hesitate. He didn't ask for thanks, he didn't make speeches in the Great Hall, but every day Flitwick patrolled the corridors, inspecting enchanted objects, reinforcing charms, and watching the students more closely than ever. He was small, yes, but his courage wasn't. And in the shadows of Malfoy's plots, it was Flitwick's vigilance that saved lives. Over and over again, number 12 deeply mourned Dumbledore's death. The night Dumbledore died, Hogwarts felt hollow. The silence wasn't just in the halls. It clung to the walls, the portraits, the very air. Even the suits of armor seemed to droop. Among the staff, grief wore many faces, but none looked more broken than Professor Flitwick. When Harry passed his office, the door was ajar. Inside, Flitwick sat alone at his desk, his tiny frame barely upright, his eyes red, hands shaking. In Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, J.K. Rowling wrote, Flitwick was sobbing quietly into a handkerchief the size of a napkin. It wasn't just mourning, it was heartbreak. Dumbledore had trusted him with the protection of the school, with students, with secrets. They had worked side by side for years. To Flitwick, he wasn't just a headmaster. He was a friend, a guide, and a light in the darkest times. He didn't speak much at the funeral. He didn't need to. His grief was visible in the way he moved, slower, smaller. Students noticed. Even Peeves, the mischievous poltergeist, dared not prank him. During the procession, Flitwick clutched a bouquet of enchanted lilies that hovered gently in the air. Their glow flickered with his breath, as if responding to his sorrow. No words were spoken. None were needed. Afterwards, he returned to teaching with quiet determination. But something had changed. He was still kind, still patient, but his eyes held a deeper sadness. He kept Dumbledore's favourite phoenix sculpture on his desk. And once, when a student asked why, Flitwick replied softly, "Because he always rose when we needed him. And I hope someday will rise too." Number 13. Fought off giants during the Battle of Hogwarts. During the Battle of Hogwarts, chaos thundered through the castle grounds. Giants stormed through the defences, crushing stone and tearing apart the barricades. They were massive, violent, and nearly unstoppable. But standing at the front lines was Professor Flitwick, small in stature, but fierce in magic. With a sharp flick of his wand and a spell shouted in a high, commanding voice, he hurled one of the giants off its feet. The creature slammed into a courtyard wall, roaring in pain. Flitwick didn't flinch. In Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, J.K. Rowling writes that tiny Professor Flitwick had just dispatched Yaxley with a well-aimed, stunning spell moments before joining the fight against the giants. That detail alone says everything. While Death Eaters fled or fell, Flitwick held the line, dueling not just dark wizards, but towering monsters bred for war. His spells crackled through the air, silver and gold arcs of power slicing through the smoke. He didn't fight with brute strength. He didn't need to. Flitwick relied on precision, timing, and sheer magical force. His incantations were layered, sharp, and perfectly cast. When one giant tried to swing a tree trunk like a club, Flitwick enchanted the ground beneath it to erupt, knocking it off balance before stunning it mid-fall. That level of control, under pressure, in the dark, with lives on the line, marked him as one of the greatest duelists of his age. No one expected the tiny charms professor to be among the fiercest warriors that night, but he was. Not for glory, not for pride, but because he was defending his students, his school, his home. He didn't raise his voice, he raised his wand, and even giants had to yield. Number 14 secretly gave Harry candy after his Skeeter interview. The Daily Prophet had turned its back on Harry. After the return of Lord Voldemort, few dared to speak the truth, but Harry did. In Order of the Phoenix, he gave an interview to the Quibbler written by Luna Lovegood's father. In it, he spoke about Cedric Diggory's death, Voldemort's rise, and the Ministry's silence. For the first time, the students saw Harry not just as the boy who lived, but as someone who had lived through horror and chose to speak out. Many teachers remained silent. They couldn't risk Umbridge's punishment, but some found quiet ways to show support. Professor Flitwick was among them. The day after the interview was published, Harry returned to the Gryffindor common room to find a small, neatly wrapped box on his pillow. Inside were 4 chocolate frogs and a tiny note that simply read, "For bravery, not only with a wand, FF." Flitwick never mentioned the gift. He never looked at Harry differently in class or gave him special treatment. But that one gesture spoke volumes. Harry recognized the writing. He didn't need to ask. He knew. In a school filled with fear and suspicion, Flitwick's quiet kindness gave him something he desperately needed, a reminder that not all adults had abandoned him. That box of sweets meant more than 1,000 words. Flitwick, though small in stature, had a heart large enough to stand for truth in silence. He believed in doing the right thing, not with grand speeches, but with simple acts. And in that moment, Harry knew he wasn't alone. Number 15 loved using live fairies for Christmas decorations. In Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, the Great Hall was dressed in its finest for Christmas. 12 towering trees lined the stone walls, glittering with golden stars and shimmering tinsel. But what truly caught the eye were the tiny, winged fairies darting among the branches. They weren't decorations in the traditional sense. They were alive. enchanted by none other than Professor Phileas Flitwick. With each flutter, they left trails of sparkling light, like snow caught in moonbeams. It was Flitwick's signature touch. While other teachers focused on logistics or supervision, Flitwick made magic tangible. His decorations weren't just beautiful, they breathed. In one scene, Harry watches a fairy settle on the tip of a tree, her wings glistening like ice. Flitwick had conjured hundreds of them, the narration implies with awe. Each fairy was a brushstroke in the professor's living painting of Christmas. This attention to detail was typical of Flitwick. Though small in stature, his presence filled the hall. He moved between trees, wand-dancing, humming softly under his breath. There was a childlike joy in him that echoed through his magic. He didn't just cast spells, he celebrated them. And every fairy that blinked into life was proof of his quiet genius. More than decoration, the fairies were a reflection of his heart. Flitwick taught charms, yes, but he also taught wonder. To see the hall through his eyes was to see magic not as power, but as beauty. As Fred Weasley once joked, if Flitwick ever retires, Christmas might too. No one laughed harder than Flitwick himself, a man who knew that the smallest spells could light the biggest smiles. Number 16 praised Hermione's shield charm in class. Of all the moments that marked Hermione Granger's meteoric rise through the ranks of young witches at Hogwarts, few carried as much quiet weight as the afternoon in the charms classroom when Professor Phileas Flitwick, master of spells, dueling champion, and head of Ravenclaw House, paused his brisk steps, tilted his head in that curious way of his, and praised Hermione's execution of the shield charm with a sincerity that silenced the room. It was a Wednesday afternoon, the kind when light from the high arched windows slanted in golden strips across the classroom floor, and the air was tinged with the lingering scent of spell smoke. Fourth-year students had gathered, wands at the ready, for what Professor Flitwick had promised would be a practical session on defensive spells. "Real magic," he had said that morning at breakfast, his feet swinging from the staff table. "Magic that protects, magic that matters." Hermione had arrived early, as always, already muttering incantations under her breath, her wand tucked behind her ear like a quill. Ron Weasley and Harry Potter, still rubbing sleep from their eyes, had taken their usual seats beside her. And when Flitwick burst into the room, robes fluttering behind him like wings, he clapped his hands with delight and announced, "Today we tackle Protego." The shield charm was no simple swish and flick. Unlike the Lumos spell or even levitation, Protego required strength, timing, and above all, clarity of intent. It was not about dazzling effects or flashy lights. It was about conjuring a magical barrier between oneself and an incoming spell, an act of pure will. Most of the students struggled with it. Neville Longbottom managed only a faint shimmer of blue before his shield collapsed like a popped bubble. Lavender Brown squealed when her own shield backfired and knocked her wand across the floor. Even Harry, who had been practicing dueling techniques with Sirius and Lupin the year before, found himself unable to fully stabilize the charm in the tight, focused classroom setting. But Hermione stood up straight, took one careful breath, and whispered, "Protego," with calm authority. The effect was immediate. A silver ripple of magic surged from her wand, forming a curved, translucent barrier that shimmered like heated glass. It held steady, humming softly, repelling Flitwick's test jinx with ease. The class froze. Even Ron's sarcastic mutterings faded into stunned silence. Professor Flitwick blinked once, then he placed a hand over his tiny heart and said, in that high, squeaky voice of his, "Miss Granger, astonishing, simply astonishing. That was textbook shield charm technique. No, better than textbook. That's the kind of charm work I'd expect from a 7th year preparing for NEUTs." Hermione blushed deeply, but there was no hiding the spark of pride in her eyes. She had not just performed the spell, she had mastered it. In that moment, the charms classroom became her stage, and the respect of a seasoned professor, the charms master of Britain no less, was her reward. It was not the first time Flitwick had noticed her talent. As early as her first year, he had quietly remarked on her potential after she managed the levitation charm with perfect precision. Swish and flick, yes, but her wand control is instinctive, he had confided to Professor McGonagall. But this public recognition, delivered in front of her peers, was different. It solidified Hermione's place not just as the smartest girl in her year, but as a witch of remarkable discipline and power. Later that week, when asked by Parvati Patil how she had managed to pull it off, Hermione simply shrugged and said, "I studied." But the truth was more than books. Hermione had practiced late at night in the empty Gryffindor common room, reinforcing the connection between her mind and her magic, understanding the purpose behind the shield, not to hide, but to stand firm. Professor Flitwick, for his part, made a note in his private teaching ledger. "Granger, Hermione," he wrote, "shield charm execution exceptional. Must consider recommendation for advanced dueling seminar." He rarely praised so openly. His standards were as high as the tower of his house, but when he did, it was never undeserved. Years later, when Hermione stood in the Department of Mysteries, wand in hand, surrounded by swirling death spells and shrieking prophecy orbs, it was that same shield charm that saved her life. Dolahov's curse, dark and slicing, rebounded against her magical barrier with a sound like shattered glass. Harry, breathing hard beside her, whispered, "You still remember how to block?" She nodded, and they moved on, shield raised. That moment in the charms classroom had been more than a lesson. It was a prophecy fulfilled in its own way. The books mention little of it directly. After all, Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire had its own share of dramatic distractions. But there is a telling line during one of the Defense Against the Dark Arts lessons where Hermione deflects a jinx, and Professor Moody, or Barty Crouch Jr. in disguise, mutters, "Huh, you've had practice." She had. It began with Flitwick's lesson. More than anything, Flitwick's praise reflected his own values. He was not dazzled by raw power alone, he had seen plenty of it. What impressed him was dedication, finesse, and intent. "Magic is not in the strength of your arm," he once told his students, "but in the steadiness of your purpose." Hermione embodied that. The day after the lesson, Professor Flitwick left a small note on Hermione's desk, decorated with dancing musical notes that played a soft chord when opened. It read, "Your diligence honors this art. Keep casting." She kept it tucked in the pages of the Standard Book of Spells Grade 4, where it stayed even after the Battle of Hogwarts. Years down the line, when Hermione would return to Hogwarts as a guest lecturer on magical law and regulation, Professor Flitwick, retired, but still attending select lectures, would introduce her with pride. "My finest student," he would say, "and the only one who ever asked me about the magical theory behind sound-based shielding fields." Number 17. Tried to maintain order during Celestina Warbeck concerts. Professor Phileas Flitwick had always been more than just the diminutive charms master of Hogwarts. Beneath his pointed hat and fluttering robes, behind the spectacles that glinted like moonlight on fresh snow, lived the soul of a music lover. Not just any music, mind you, but a passionate, lifelong adoration for the enchanting voice of Celestina Warbeck, the singing sorceress whose velvety notes could make even the sternest wizard swoon. To most students, Flitwick was the cheerful professor who occasionally stood on a pile of books to be seen behind his desk. But to those who knew him well, he was also the man who hummed Celestina's ballads under his breath during breakfast and wept quietly during her Christmas broadcasts. In Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, Rowling gives us a glimpse into this hidden affection. Flitwick had been trying to persuade the choir to sing Celestina Warbeck's greatest hits at the Christmas feast, the narrator notes, with an air of amused indulgence. One might imagine the tiny professor waving his wand enthusiastically, conjuring up glittering sheet music and dancing musical notes in the air as he pleaded his case before the choir. But as much as Flitwick adored Celestina, organizing and overseeing events that featured her music was no easy task, especially when Hogwarts students were involved. Concerts were chaos. The idea, noble and melodic in theory, often became a spectacle of flying sweets, levitating pumpkins, and students hexing their programs to sing along out of tune. Yet Flitwick, ever the optimist, never gave up. He approached each musical evening with a conductor's baton in one hand and a wand in the other, determined to preserve harmony in every sense of the word. One of the most infamous events took place during the 1993 Christmas term. The Great Hall had been transformed into a glittering auditorium, enchanted snow cascading from the bewitched ceiling, and golden instruments floating near the rafters. Flitwick had spent weeks rehearsing the Hogwarts choir to perform "You Stole My Cauldron, But You Can't Have My Heart," a Warbeck classic filled with magical metaphors and dramatic swoons. The students, led by a particularly sulky fourth year named Mortimer Gudgeon on lead vocals, had little patience for the melodrama. By the time the second verse arrived, the front row, mostly Slytherins, had charmed their scarves to sing in disharmonious harmony, while the Gryffindor twins, Fred and George Weasley, had enchanted the ceiling to rain down heart-shaped confetti that whispered the chorus line every time it touched the floor. Flitwick, struggling to maintain order, darted between rows with a flurry of quietus and silencio spells, his arms barely visible behind clouds of enchanted glitter. "Please, students, let's honor the spirit of the performance," he squeaked, standing on a levitating chair for better reach. Yet the room only roared louder, not with mockery, but sheer adolescent glee. In the end, the performance collapsed into impromptu laughter and a spontaneous conga line led by Peeves, the poltergeist, who wore a bewitched banner reading "Team Celestina Forever." That night, Professor McGonagall was not amused. She pursed her lips so tightly that even her spectacles seemed to narrow. "Phileas, I do believe we need to have stricter guidelines next time," she said, arms crossed beneath her tartan shawl. But Flitwick merely smiled, brushing a confetti heart from his shoulder. "Oh, but they were enjoying the music, Minerva. That's what matters, isn't it?" Another memorable moment came 2 years later, when Celestina Warbeck herself sent a signed, magical recording to the school. A rare gift enchanted to project a three-dimensional illusion of her performance. Flitwick had tears in his eyes as he set it up in the courtyard. Students gathered eagerly, but by the end of the first chorus of "My Wand's at the Ready, and So Is My Heart," a group of mischievous third years had transfigured the backup dancers into dancing pineapples. The illusion grew confused. Celestina twirled into the arms of a pineapple prince, and Flitwick had to cast a panicked, finite incantatem before the performance turned into a surrealist fruit opera. Flitwick's attempts to bring Celestina into the Hogwarts musical canon were not merely fanboy gestures. He believed deeply in the power of magical music, not just as entertainment, but as a way to unite the students, to give them joy in dark times. During the tense years of Voldemort's return, when gloom hung over the castle like an enchanted storm cloud, Flitwick often organized small recitals, encouraging the choir to perform upbeat Warbeck tunes. He would conduct them himself, baton trembling, voice cracking as he sang along in a whisper. Some students mocked these efforts, but others found solace. Luna Lovegood once confided to Flitwick after a rehearsal that Celestina's music reminded her of her mother's humming. "It makes the walls feel softer," she said, dreamy-eyed. Flitwick blinked behind his spectacles, then gently touched her shoulder. "That's exactly why we sing," he replied. Despite his gentle nature, Flitwick did try to enforce discipline. He issued scrolls with concert etiquette, encouraged students to enchant their programs to glow rather than shout, and even threatened to cancel performances when behavior got out of hand. Yet his stature, both literal and figurative, often worked against him. Few took him seriously as a disciplinarian. Even when he stood on enchanted platforms or summoned a booming sonorous spell to hush the audience, his voice still carried a warmth that made it impossible to truly fear him. One night, during a spring concert in the courtyard, a duel broke out between two Ravenclaws arguing over who knew more about Celestina's secret love life. The duel escalated until one student levitated the other into the lake, where he emerged drenched and singing the bridge to "Axio My Heart Back." Flitwick sighed, flicked his wand, and dried them both. 10 points from Ravenclaw," he said gently, "and let's stick to harmonies, not hexes." Number 18 assessed Fred and George's enchantment skills. The classroom was unusually quiet that morning, not because the students weren't chattering. Fred and George Weasley could hardly stay silent even on their best days, but because there was something electric in the air, a tension, an anticipation. Professor Phileas Flitwick, small in stature but towering in magical knowledge, stood at the front of the charms classroom at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, his wand glimmering faintly in the early light. Before him stood two of his most unorthodox students, both grinning from ear to ear, their identical red heads slightly bowed, not from humility, but from plotting. Fred and George had never been what anyone would call model students. Their academic reports were scattered with comments like easily distracted, disruptive in class, and endlessly inventive, sometimes dangerously so. Yet here they were, voluntarily appearing before a professor, not in detention, but in pursuit of something surprisingly serious, their enchanting mastery certification. "Now then," said Flitwick, clapping his hands together, "let's see what you two have cooked up for me today." The exam wasn't a standard NEBUICE, nor was it officially part of the Hogwarts curriculum. Rather, it was a special examination requested by the twins themselves. In order to begin licensing some of their magical inventions, the Weasley twins needed formal confirmation that they were capable of advanced enchantment work, particularly on non-magical objects. Who better to judge than the charms master himself? "We call it the Peruvian Instant Darkness Powder Demonstration," George announced, pulling a small pouch from his robe. Fred took over immediately. "But don't worry, sir, it's got a timed charm. Total blackout lasts exactly 10 seconds. Then, poof, light returns. Perfect for tactical getaways or just giving Filch a heart attack." Professor Flitwick raised one eyebrow in what could only be described as intrigued amusement. "Time darkness? Interesting. Show me." With a theatrical flourish, George tossed a pinch of the shimmering black powder into the air. A split second later, the entire room was engulfed in impenetrable darkness. Even Flitwick, who had once competed in the All-England Wizarding Dueling competition, found himself momentarily disoriented. Just as he reached for his wand to cast Lumos, the darkness vanished. The room was unchanged except for a now gaping, amazed smile on Flitwick's face. "Marvelous," he chirped. "Absolutely marvelous." It wasn't the first time Flitwick had seen brilliance masked behind mischief. He had always believed that magic was as much about creativity as it was about incantations and wand work. "They may be pranksters," he had once told Minerva McGonagall over tea in the staff room, "but their understanding of magical theory is quite profound. I've seen sixth years struggle with basic enchantments, and yet these two, they imbue humour with genuine magical sophistication. Their demonstration didn't stop at powders. Fred and George presented a selection of enchanted products, skiving snack boxes, Tun-Tung toffees, and canary creams. Each item had a magical twist designed with layers of spellwork that Flitwick insisted on analysing. When Fred offered him a puking pastille, Flitwick laughed heartily. "I'll pass, thank you, I trust it works." Then, peering closely at the half-orange, half-purple candy, he added, "You've embedded a disgorging charm within a delayed reaction hex, haven't you?" George's grin widened. "Spot on, Professor." This was the kind of ingenuity that delighted Flitwick. He wasn't just looking for textbook execution, he wanted to see originality. Anyone could copy a charm from a book, but designing magical effects that dance between the ridiculous and the revolutionary, that was an art. After reviewing a particularly complex product, decoy detonators, small scuttling devices that exploded with a loud bang to distract and divert, Flitwick leaned back in his chair and looked thoughtfully at the twins. "You've managed to synchronize a proximity charm with a nocturne activation trigger," he said quietly. "That's any WT level enchantment, perhaps even beyond." "Where did you two learn that?" Fred shrugged. "Bit of reading? Bit of experimenting? Lot of explosions?" "Mostly in our room," George added. "Once blew up a whole stack of socks." Flitwick chuckled. "You remind me of a young Adelbert waffling. He was eccentric too, wrote half the theories we now teach. Of course, he didn't sell products that made people grow boils, but he would have appreciated the spirit." Though it was never described in detail in the books, J.K. Rowling confirmed in interviews that Professor Flitwick personally assessed the Weasley twins' enchanting capabilities before they opened Weasley's Wizard Wheezes. It made perfect sense. No other professor combined such a deep love for technical magic with a surprisingly playful heart. Professor Flitwick's always had a soft spot for students who think outside the cauldron, Lee Jordan once said in an interview with the Daily Prophet. He's not into rule-breaking per se, but he knows genius when he sees it. And those two, they had it in spades. During the exam, Flitwick took detailed notes, not of mistakes, but of enchantment layering, spell anchoring, and unintended side effects. He even offered feedback. "Your portable swamp spell, ingenious, but it could use a containment charm at the edges, otherwise you risk it spreading to unintended areas." George nodded, scribbling the suggestion into a small, leather-bound notebook. "Wouldn't want another incident like the charms corridor." Fred sighed dramatically. "Poor Filch, still finding frogs in the walls." Flitwick laughed again. "Well, I won't tell him who's responsible if you don't tell him I enjoyed it." There was a moment, just a heartbeat, when the mischief faded from the twins' eyes, replaced by something more earnest. "Thank you, Professor," Fred said. "For taking us seriously," George added. Flitwick gave a small bow. "Magic is not always about seriousness, but it is always about intent. Yours is pure, if occasionally chaotic." He passed them without hesitation. In that room, with enchanted toffees and smoky remnants of instant darkness still lingering in the air, Fred and George Weasley earned more than a certification. They earned the respect of a master, a wizard who had seen centuries of spellwork and innovation, and who now saw in two young pranksters the flicker of future greatness. Years later, when their shop in Diagon Alley became the most talked-about magical establishment in London, Flitwick was often asked about it by younger students. Number 20 created magical rain to extinguish cursed fires. The night sky above Hogwarts burned red as fire consumed the enchanted ceilings and shattered windows. Flames danced across ancient stone corridors like serpents, hissing and devouring. The Battle of Hogwarts was at its most intense, and the defenders, students, professors, and members of the Order fought tooth and wand to hold back the Death Eaters who surged like a storm. Amid the chaos and screams as curses ricocheted off the very walls that had once echoed only with the laughter of students, a figure emerged with a calm command of magic that silenced even the roaring blaze. Professor Phileas Flitwick, the tiny charms master with the bright eyes and unshakable voice, stepped onto the charred marble of the grand staircase. His robes were scorched, his brow furrowed, but his wand hand was steady. While others shouted defensive spells and hastily transfigured rubble into barricades, Flitwick did something that few had ever witnessed. He raised his wand high into the smoke-choked air and murmured an incantation that shimmered with ancient magic. Then, as if the very sky obeyed him, rain began to fall inside the castle. But this was no ordinary water conjured by a quick aguamenti, or even the more forceful aqua eructo. This was rain woven with purpose and precision, a magical phenomenon so rare that most witches and wizards had only heard of it in theory. It fell in glittering sheets, each droplet humming faintly with arcane energy. As the droplets touched fire, even the cursed flames conjured by dark spells, ones that resisted ordinary dousing, hissed and dissolved into harmless steam. In Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, the scene is brief but unforgettable. As the Death Eaters breached the castle walls, casting fiend fire and other dark spells, Flitwick used his expertise not to fight directly, but to control the environment itself. Professor Flitwick had conjured a charmed rain, falling from the broken ceiling above, putting out the fires that licked at the tapestries and furniture. D.H. Chapter 31. That single sentence encapsulates his quiet but monumental contribution. While giants stomped through courtyards and duels raged in classrooms, Flitwick, often overlooked for his size, turned back death itself with a spell few could replicate. The spell he used was not taught at Hogwarts. It was an advanced form of elemental manipulation, and only a handful of master-level charms experts were known to perform it. Some believed it had roots in old weather-controlling charms developed during the Goblin rebellions, adapted by wizard engineers to protect magical structures from siege fire. Flitwick, who was half goblin himself, may have had access to arcane knowledge lost to others, or perhaps he had simply studied harder and reached further into the depths of magical theory than his peers. The rain he conjured didn't just extinguish physical flames, it disrupted the very essence of destructive enchantments. Dolohov, a particularly cruel Death Eater known for his silent, purple-slashing curses, attempted to ignite another section of the corridor where Flitwick's rain was falling. His wand sparked, the curse sizzled, and then it fizzled into nothing as droplets danced in the air. For the first time in the night, Dolohov hesitated. This wasn't just power, it was finesse. While wizards like Kingsley Shacklebolt and Minerva McGonagall battled foes with flashes of brilliance and raw might, Flitwick demonstrated the art of subtle control. It's one thing to destroy, it's another to undo destruction with grace. The charmed rain soothed the chaos, muffled the screams, and gave defenders breathing room. In the quiet corners of the castle where it fell, children wept less, fires died faster, and hope lasted longer. Even the Death Eaters, brutal and arrogant, paused when they saw the spell at work. That little goblin conjures rain like it's the gods themselves answering his call. One was heard to mutter before being stunned into unconsciousness by a pair of dueling raven claws. Flitwick's command of the elements earned him a strange, reluctant respect from enemies who believed only in brute strength and terror. In the face of magical barbarism, he answered with a storm of his own. What made this feat even more impressive was that Flitwick, by then well into his 60s or 70s, was battling exhaustion. He had spent the hours before the assault erecting defensive wards, helping students prepare, and coordinating the resistance alongside McGonagall and Sprout. The charm required to summon such rain was not just complex, it was draining. It demanded clarity of intent, a deep emotional reservoir, and absolute precision. A single mistake, a misdirected will, and the rain could have frozen into deadly shards or drowned sections of the castle. But Flitwick did not falter. His wand, made of spruce and 10¼ inches long, moved in tight, looping arcs, evidence of a style more akin to dueling than ritual magic. Indeed, before becoming a professor, Flitwick had been a dueling champion, known for his speed and creativity in spellwork. He hadn't lost his touch. Each gesture seemed to pull moisture from the very bones of the castle, turning ancient stone into reservoirs. The droplets began to glow faintly blue, as if blessed by the protective spirits of the founders themselves. It was not the first time Flitwick had demonstrated his brilliance in high-pressure situations. In Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, he was tasked with defending Hogwarts when Death Eater activity increased. Though the scene was cut short in the narrative, it is noted that Flitwick was sweeping through the corridors, muttering incantations that left protective charms shimmering on the walls. HBP Chapter 27. Always on the move, always preparing. That night, during the final battle, all those preparations came to bear. Students remembered it later. "I was hiding behind a statue when the fire started crawling up the wall," said Dennis Creevey in an interview recorded by the Daily Prophet after the war. "I thought I'd be burned alive, and then this rain, this beautiful blue rain, just came out of nowhere. It smelled like lavender. It felt safe." His voice cracked with emotion. "Professor Flitwick saved me. I never even saw him." That was how Flitwick worked. Not with glory, not with speeches, but with silent, focused brilliance. In the weeks that followed, as tales of heroism were told and statues were erected to the fallen, Flitwick returned to his quarters with little fanfare. He refused offers to write memoirs. "Let the students remember their own strength," he was overheard saying. "That was their night, not mine." But those who knew magic, those who understood what it took to do what he did, kept telling the tale. Some said Flitwick had been offered a seat on the Wizengamot afterward. Others whispered that the Department of Mysteries requested his help deciphering lost elemental magic. He declined both. Hogwarts was his home, and he returned to teaching Wingardium Leviosa with the same joy he had always shown. Yet something had changed. In later years, students noticed that during certain spells, when he taught water manipulation, he would pause for a moment, his eyes distant. "Water can be your ally," he once told a first-year Hufflepuff. "It remembers kindness and it remembers fear. Treat it well and it will protect you when fire comes." His enchanted rain became legend among the new generation of Hogwarts students. Some tried to replicate it to no avail. The secret, they realized, was not just in technique, but in the heart behind it. Flitwick's rain was woven not merely from spell work, but from the will to protect, the refusal to give in to destruction, and the belief that even in war, beauty could exist. In a world where magic often leaned on violence, Flitwick's choice to wield creation over annihilation stood as a quiet rebellion. His rain did not just extinguish flames, it restored humanity to a battlefield that had nearly lost it. When Hermione Granger, later Minister for Magic, was asked in an interview who she believed saved the most lives during the Battle of Hogwarts, she didn't hesitate. "Everyone knows about Molly Weasley and Bellatrix," she said. "But Flitwick saved entire wings of the castle. Without him, more than fire would have consumed us." In the end, Flitwick's legacy was not carved in marble, but whispered in stories, passed from student to student, remembered whenever a young witch tried to charm a floating raindrop, and wondered what it would take to make it sing. Number 21 helped enchant protective spells over Hogwarts. The threat was in the air long before the Death Eaters ever stepped onto the grounds of Hogwarts. Whispers echoed in the corridors, and the wind itself seemed to carry warnings. Voldemort was back, not as rumour, not as myth, but in blood and darkness. And though the Ministry faltered in its belief, Hogwarts had no such luxury. Albus Dumbledore knew better. In preparation for what was to come, he turned to those he trusted most. Among them stood a figure often underestimated, though never by Dumbledore himself, Professor Filius Flitwick. Flitwick, the charms master of Hogwarts, was not a man of grand speeches or ominous warnings. He moved through the castle with quiet confidence, his small stature belying the sheer power he carried. A former dueling champion, he knew not just the mechanics of magic, but the art of it. When Dumbledore called upon him to enhance the protective enchantments around Hogwarts, Flitwick answered with a simple nod. Words were not needed, the stakes were understood. The first spells Flitwick cast were invisible to the naked eye, but any witch or wizard of proper education would have felt the shift in the air. "Hogwarts has always been safe," he whispered to Minerva McGonagall late one night in the Great Hall, "but now it must be impenetrable." Together they worked under moonlight and candlelight, layering enchantment upon enchantment, some ancient, others new, all designed to hold back the dark tide rising just beyond the forbidden forest. He started with the perimeter, the outermost edge of the grounds. Ancient wards, long dormant, were reawakened by his command. Anti-apparition jinxes were renewed and strengthened, while detection charms formed invisible tripwires that could sense intent. "It's not just about keeping them out," Flitwick said to Dumbledore. "It's about knowing when they're coming." Dumbledore agreed. He gave Flitwick full autonomy in the magical architecture of Hogwarts' defense. Few others knew how to weave charms with such complexity, and fewer still could do it with the precision needed for a castle as layered and volatile as Hogwarts. "You understand the walls like they breathe," Dumbledore once told him, smiling. "You charm them as if they listen." The charms weren't merely defensive, they were intelligent. Some reacted to the emotions of intruders, gauging malice and fear. Others disguised entire corridors from unwanted eyes, bending space and shifting stairways. It was Flitwick's idea to enchant the armor that lined the halls. "Let them not just be decoration," he said. "Let them defend." At his command, the suits of armor became dormant guardians, capable of springing to life at the first sign of invasion. One of his proudest creations was a detection field outside the Room of Requirement, a place known to shift form according to need. Knowing it could be both refuge and liability, Flitwick embedded charms that would alert him if it was being accessed by unfamiliar magical signatures. "The room has a will," he said, "but even it can be watched." When Death Eaters began circling Hogwarts like wolves outside a gate, Flitwick's enchantments proved their worth. During the attempted attack in the spring of 1997, when Draco Malfoy found a way to bring the enemy inside, the protections delayed their advance. The barriers above the astronomy tower shimmered with blue light as cursed spells struck them, each one absorbed or deflected by layers of charms woven through stone and spellwork. In The Half-Blood Prince, after the attack, Professor McGonagall mentions how much stronger the spells around the school had become. "We have Professor Flitwick to thank for that," she said, with a touch of reverence. And she was right. The castle held longer than it should have, giving just enough time for chaos to become strategy. Flitwick never boasted of his work, but there was a moment, just one, when he allowed himself a small smile. It was during a brief respite, walking past a window that looked down on the Black Lake. The moon glinted off the water, and for a moment all was still. He touched the stone wall beside him. "You're holding strong," he whispered. "Good." The enchantments evolved with the war. As Voldemort gained strength, so did the counter-spells. Flitwick introduced new barriers at the gates and instructed the house elves on how to maintain magical currents through the kitchens and lower chambers. Even Peeves, the poltergeist, was recruited. With a bit of charm-infused bribery, Flitwick got him to act as an alarm system, disturbing the air whenever an unwelcome presence crept too close. When Dumbledore fell from the astronomy tower, Flitwick mourned with the others, but he did not stop. He could not. His work took on a new urgency. Alongside McGonagall, he became one of the chief defenders of Hogwarts in the absence of its headmaster. He worked with Horace Slughorn and Pomona Sprout, sharing knowledge, casting wide nets of enchantments, and preparing for the inevitable storm. During the final battle, the Battle of Hogwarts, Flitwick stood firm. He did not hide behind books or theory. He took his place at the front lines, casting barrier charms faster than most could blink, reinforcing doorways, sealing tunnels. One of his greatest contributions that night was the enchantment of the bridge leading to the viaduct courtyard. As Death Eaters approached, he collapsed the middle of the bridge with a single gesture, timing it perfectly. "Let them fly if they can," he muttered, wand raised. Later that night, he faced off against Antonin Dolohov. The duel lit up the entrance hall with sparks and flashes. Dolohov, brutal and experienced, was forced to retreat under the relentless precision of Flitwick's charms. It was not brute force that beat Dolohov, it was brilliance. "Expulso, Ventus, Protego Totalum." Flitwick's voice rang out, each incantation blending into the next, like notes in a symphony of defense. Luna Lovegood once said, "Professor Flitwick has such a kind heart. You'd never guess he was so powerful unless you saw him duel." She was right. Behind his gentle demeanor was a storm of magical prowess, honed by decades of study and sharpened by necessity. After the war, the extent of his enchantments became more widely known. Many of the spells he had created during those dark times were added to the curriculum for advanced charm students. He never demanded credit. "Let the work speak for itself," he said. But for those who had fought and survived, they never forgot who kept the walls standing. Even now, years later, visitors to Hogwarts might pass through a doorway or down a staircase and feel something tingle in the air. They are brushing against Flitwick's legacy, layers of protection that still hum with ancient power. "A good charm," he once told a young Ravenclaw, "is like a whisper in the stone. It lasts as long as someone listens." His portrait, now hanging in the charms classroom, holds a quiet watch. It does not speak unless spoken to, but when it does, the voice is calm, assured. "You're safe," it might say. "As long as the walls remember, you're safe." Harry Potter himself, when asked in an interview for the Daily Prophet, once said, "Without Professor Flitwick, Hogwarts wouldn't have stood. He was one of the quiet heroes, and in war those are the ones who often save us." There are countless spells in the magical world, curses that can destroy, jinxes that can twist, hexes that can harm. But the spells Flitwick cast did something more. They endured. And in doing so, they protected not just a school, but a future, because as long as Hogwarts stood, hope did too. And for that, we owe Professor Flitwick more than words could ever say. Number 22 admired Luna Lovegood's unconventional thinking. Of all the professors at Hogwarts, few understood the delicate balance between discipline and imagination better than Professor Phileas Flitwick. Though small in stature, he possessed a towering intellect and an even greater heart. As the Charms Master and head of Ravenclaw House, he had seen generations of young witches and wizards pass through his classroom, but among them One student in particular had always stood out, not for academic brilliance or predictable excellence, but for her uncanny ability to see the world through a different lens. That student was Luna Lovegood. Most of the Hogwarts staff regarded Luna with gentle bemusement. With her dreamy voice, wild theories, and radish earrings, she often drifted through the corridors like a spectre from another world. But Flitwick saw something few others did, an extraordinary mind at work. He never dismissed her unusual insights or the strange creatures she spoke of with such certainty. In fact, he considered her perspective not only valid, but valuable. It was no surprise to anyone who knew him well that he often said, "People like her make magic truly interesting." He first noticed her uniqueness during a third-year charms class when Luna had been tasked with casting the silencing charm. While most students followed the standard method, wand tip precisely angled, incantation spoken with the correct emphasis, Luna took a different approach. She hummed softly to her toadstool-patterned wand before casting, and to everyone's surprise, the spell worked flawlessly. Some students snickered. Professor Flitwick, however, gave her a nod of quiet approval. That evening he wrote a note in her file. Unconventional magical approach, remarkable affinity for enchantments, observe future development closely. It was rare for him to comment so early in students' academic career, but he sensed there was more to Luna than met the eye. Her wand work lacked precision, but it overflowed with intent. Intent, as he often reminded his students, was the true heart of magic. When the time came for the practical component of the OWLs, Luna stunned the examiners with her command of the levitation charm. Instead of simply lifting the assigned feather, she had it pirouette, bow, and dance through the air like a ballerina. One of the examiners raised an eyebrow. "Odd," he muttered. Flitwick, observing from the sidelines, merely smiled. "No, not odd," he corrected gently. "Creative. Perhaps their bond deepened because Luna was a Ravenclaw. But Flitwick had never played favourites, even within his house. What drew him to her was not just her performance, but her spirit. In a world that often punished eccentricity, Luna's resilience amazed him. She was unapologetically herself, never changing to fit the mould. When others whispered about her behind her back, calling her Loony Lovegood, Flitwick was the only professor to address it directly in class. "I expect better from Ravenclaws," he had said one morning after a student had mimicked Luna's voice during a group assignment. Wisdom is not the memorization of facts, but the courage to see the world in new ways. Miss Lovegood embodies that courage. Luna, sitting at her desk with a cork necklace and ink-stained fingers, gave him a smile. It was the kind of smile that said, "Thank you for seeing me." In Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, there is a brief but poignant moment that encapsulates their relationship. After a particularly chaotic class, Luna stayed behind to ask about the theoretical possibility of reversing the effects of a confundus charm with positive emotion. It was an odd question. Most students would have asked about exams or extra credit. But Flitwick didn't dismiss her. He leaned forward, intrigued. "That's a fascinating idea," he told her. "There's very little research on emotional magic and its impact on mental enchantments. You may be onto something." Later, when speaking with Professor Sprout over dinner, he brought it up again. "That girl," he said, referring to Luna, "has a mind like the edge of a blade, unpredictable, sharp, and capable of cutting through the fog of convention. It wasn't all about magic, though. Flitwick admired Luna's emotional intelligence just as much. After the death of her mother, Luna had returned to Hogwarts with quiet dignity. She never sought pity. Instead, she embraced life more fully, believing in things others scoffed at because they made the world more magical, not less. That kind of spirit, Flitwick believed, was essential in the battle against darkness. During Dumbledore's funeral, when the grounds were heavy with sorrow, Flitwick noticed Luna standing apart from the crowd. She had placed a small wreath of acorns near the lake, murmuring something to the giant squid. When he approached her, she turned and said softly, "Professor, I think Dumbledore would have liked the idea of acorn magic. It's about beginnings, not endings." He didn't correct her. He didn't remind her of botany versus spellcraft. He simply nodded, knowing that she had expressed a truth more profound than any spell could conjure. Flitwick once confided in McGonagall that he feared for the future of wizarding education, not because of danger or politics, but because too many students were being moulded into the same shape. "We're losing the ones who dream sideways," he had said. "Luna dreams upside down, backwards, and through mirrors. We need more of that." McGonagall had agreed, though in her usual brisk tone. When the Carrows took over Hogwarts under Voldemort's regime, Luna became a silent rebel. Flitwick knew what she was doing, sabotaging lessons, spreading hope, sneaking food to those in need. He couldn't say anything, not openly, but once left a small enchanted coin in her book bag. It whispered encouragement when touched. "The brave think in colours others cannot see," it would say. Luna never asked who had given it to her, but she always carried it. After the Battle of Hogwarts, when the rubble was still warm and the ghosts of the fallen lingered in the halls, Flitwick found Luna helping to repair the enchanted windows in the Charms corridor. "They were always my favourite," she said. "The sunlight looks braver through coloured glass." He had nodded, placing his hand on the frame beside hers. "Just like you, Miss Lovegood." Years later, at a small symposium on magical theory in Vienna, Flitwick gave a keynote speech. He opened not with citations or spell diagrams, but with a story. "Once, a student asked me whether joy could counteract confusion," he began. "It was the strangest question I'd ever heard, but it made me think." The audience laughed. He smiled. "I've never stopped thinking about it." Among the names he mentioned in his memoir, Whispers of the Wand, Luna Lovegood appeared more than once. "Some of my most brilliant students never earned top marks," he wrote, "but they left fingerprints on magic itself. Luna was one such student. Her curiosity defied logic. Her heart defied reason, and yet her magic was undeniable. It wasn't until Luna became a magizoologist, travelling the world in search of hidden creatures and forgotten spells, that the full extent of her influence became clear. She sent Professor Flitwick a letter from the mountains of Muradin. It was written in silver ink on black paper. "I found the dream crabs," it read. "They really do whisper secrets if you listen underwater. Thank you for believing I might one day hear them." That letter was framed and placed beside his desk, where it remained for the rest of his years at Hogwarts. Visitors often asked about it, and he would simply smile and say, "It's from a friend who taught me more about magic than any book ever could." Flitwick never sought recognition for his role in her journey, but among the portraits that now line the Ravenclaw Tower, his painted figure occasionally glances toward the starscape painted on the ceiling. "You were right, Miss Lovegood," he sometimes mutters with a twinkle in his eye. "Magic is more interesting because of people like you." When asked in an interview late in his life who his favourite student had been, Flitwick chuckled. "Oh, I couldn't possibly choose," he said. Then he paused, eyes glinting. "But there was one who saw the world not as it was, but as it could be. And that," he added softly, "is the very essence of magic." Number 23 studied forgotten spells and ancient magic. Professor Phileas Flitwick, known to many students simply as the cheerful and diminutive charms master at Hogwarts was far more than a teacher of levitation charms and wand movements. Beneath his high-pitched voice and friendly demeanor lay one of the most brilliant magical minds of his time, a scholar deeply entrenched in the mysteries of ancient magic. His pursuit of lost knowledge didn't always make the pages of the Daily Prophet, nor was it often spoken of in the corridors of the castle, but for those who paid attention, hints of his passion for the arcane were scattered throughout his years of service. Perhaps no moment revealed this more clearly than in Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, where Flitwick makes a passing remark about an ancient spell he is working to reconstruct, one meant to fortify the castle walls against dark forces. This quiet moment, easily overlooked, opens a door to a far deeper world of magical scholarship. When Dolores Umbridge tightened her grip on Hogwarts during Harry's 5th year, the atmosphere in the school grew darker by the day. Surveillance, restrictions, and punishments loomed over both students and staff. It was during this bleak chapter that Professor Flitwick subtly revealed his involvement in reviving old protective spells. While the students whispered about Dumbledore's army and the injustices of the inquisitorial squad, Flitwick was in his office, poring over tomes thick with dust and bound in dragon hide, decoding enchantments that predated even the school itself. "I'm attempting to reconstruct a spell from the Founder's era," he told Professor McGonagall one evening, according to a later account given by her in private conversation with Dumbledore's army members. "It was once used to repel siege forces from the outer walls. Complicated, archaic magic, the kind that doesn't rely on wands or words, but on intent, runes, and elemental force." Though this exchange never made it into the public memory of the war against Voldemort, it exemplified Flitwick's extraordinary intellect and commitment to magical defense. While others focused on immediate danger, he looked to history, drawing strength from magic long believed obsolete. His interest in ancient spells wasn't a recent development. As a young Ravenclaw student, Flitwick was known to spend more time in the restricted section than anywhere else. He had a particular fondness for the Chronicles of Ethelfrith the Obscure, a collection of magical treatises believed to have been penned during the early 9th century. One account suggests that he successfully translated an entire chapter written in runic Old Saxon without the aid of a decoding charm. These early studies formed the foundation for his later academic work, which included lectures at the International Confederation of Wizards Symposium on Forgotten Arts. Students knew him as the master of swish and flick, but Flitwick's personal collection of grimoires contained texts so old that their ink had faded into the parchment itself. Among them was the Grimoire of Rowena, a legendary volume said to have belonged to Rowena Ravenclaw herself. Though many believed the book to be a myth, Flitwick always smiled mysteriously when asked about it. Some say he once showed it to Dumbledore, who responded with a rare moment of visible awe. Others claim the grimoire was instrumental in casting the enchantments that held back the Death Eaters during the Battle of Hogwarts. One particular spell Flitwick sought to master was the Aegis Incantatum, an enchantment referenced in a fragmentary scroll found in the ruins of an old Scottish monastery. The spell, according to legend, created a nearly impenetrable barrier that blended elemental earth magic with blood-bonded protection. Though its exact mechanics were lost to time, Flitwick theorized that it was used during the Goblin rebellions to protect wizarding strongholds. He spent months in the castle's North Tower conducting tests with enchanted runes and elemental catalysts. The process was meticulous, requiring not only technical expertise, but also an intuitive connection with the castle itself. "I could swear I felt the stones respond," Flitwick once whispered to Professor Sprout, brushing a hand along the cold castle wall. "As if they remembered." This sense of magical memory, a resonance between the ancient structure of Hogwarts and the magic that once fortified it was central to his theory. He believed that ancient spells left imprints in magical places, echoes that a skilled wizard could read, like Braille, through time. He called this phenomenon chronomantic resonance, a term he coined himself and quietly submitted in a paper to the Department of Magical Research, where it was largely ignored. Despite the secrecy of his work, Flitwick shared pieces of it with those he trusted. During a quiet moment in the Room of Requirement, he once confided in Hermione Granger, whose thirst for knowledge reminded him of his younger self. "Magic is older than language, Miss Granger," he said. "Before wands, before spells had names, there was raw will and understanding. The founders didn't just cast magic, they were magic, and we've only scratched the surface of what they left behind." Hermione, inspired, later began her own research into runic arithmancy as part of her work with the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. One lesser-known incident, preserved in the private journals of Minerva McGonagall, recounts a night when Flitwick remained behind after the Battle of the Astronomy Tower. The staff were exhausted, grief-stricken after the loss of Albus Dumbledore, but Flitwick remained. "There's an enchantment in the stones," he murmured, eyes half-closed, wand raised in silence. That night, a warm golden glow briefly shimmered around the castle's perimeter. Nobody knew exactly what it meant, only that Flitwick had been at the center of it. His work in ancient magic was not without danger. In the late 1980s, long before Voldemort's return, Flitwick reportedly suffered a magical backlash while experimenting with a reconstructed enchantment believed to summon a protective guardian from earth and stone. The incident left a fracture in the stone floor of his classroom that could never be repaired, no matter how many times it was repaved. Students joked that it was just his clumsiness, but those in the know recognized it as a scar, a reminder of his bold foray into unstable, forgotten magic. Albus Dumbledore once said, "There are few who truly understand the roots of magic. Filius is one of them." Their mutual respect ran deep. In the early 1990s, Flitwick helped Dumbledore reconstruct several protective enchantments around the castle, using spells that dated back to the Wizarding Wars of the 14th century. These defenses were woven so subtly into the fabric of Hogwarts that even Voldemort's forces couldn't unravel them during the final siege. It was Flitwick who recommended reactivating the Defensa Triplum, a triple-layered charm requiring 3 wizards to cast simultaneously, one for the mind, one for the heart, and one for the will. Flitwick's dual heritage, part goblin, part wizard, also granted him unique insight into magical traditions that many pure bloods ignored. Goblin magic, with its emphasis on binding contracts, metalcraft, and elemental harmonics, deeply influenced his interpretations of early wizarding spells. He often claimed that ancient magic wasn't lost, it was simply ignored by those too arrogant to look beyond the surface. His lectures occasionally hinted at this. "Modern spellcraft is efficient," he once told a class, "but sometimes I wonder what we sacrificed for convenience." During the lead-up to the Battle of Hogwarts, while many professors prepared students for combat, Flitwick spent hours in the castle archives, reopening rooms that had not been touched for centuries. One such chamber, located beneath the Ravenclaw Tower, was known as Sorrow's Niche, a place where Rowena herself was said to have meditated. There, Flitwick uncovered a sequence of runes etched in silver and lapis lazuli. He believed they were part of a ritual that had once infused the castle with magical resilience, and he used them as a blueprint to reinforce Hogwarts' defenses in its darkest hour. When the Death Eaters finally breached the grounds, they encountered more than shield charms and barricades. Whispers spoke of invisible hands deflecting curses, walls that refused to crumble under bombardment, and staircases that misled invaders into sealed dungeons. These weren't standard defensive spells. They were the result of Flitwick's reconstructed enchantments, culled from centuries of magical tradition and bound into the very architecture of the school. His quiet work had become the last line of defense. After the war, Flitwick refused any public accolades. He returned to teaching charms with the same cheer as always, his voice squeaking with excitement as he demonstrated the wand-lighting charm. Yet in the evenings he continued his translations, now working on a series of scrolls attributed to Hermione the Grey, a warlock known for his spells of unmaking. Ancient counter-curses so powerful that they required the caster to sacrifice a memory with each use. In 2004, Hermione Granger, then a rising star at the Ministry, invited Flitwick to co-author a paper on the ethical implications of memory-bound spellcraft. He declined the offer to co-publish, but sent her his notes, handwritten, full of marginalia, and ending with a line that she would later quote in a speech to the Wizengamot. "Magic without understanding is power without purpose." To this day, the walls of Hogwarts stand strong, not merely from stone and mortar, but from spells long forgotten by most. And at the heart of those enduring enchantments is the quiet genius of Professor Phileas Flitwick, the scholar of ancient magic who believed that the past held the key to the future. Number 24 calmed a rampaging Christmas tree with charm work. It was a cold December evening at Hogwarts, and snow had begun to pile up along the edges of the ancient windows. The castle hummed with a festive energy as students bustled through the halls in scarves and mittens, their breath misting in the frosty air. Inside the Great Hall, preparations for the annual Christmas feast were underway. Floating candles flickered gently overhead, casting golden light on the enchanted ceiling, which mirrored the snow-covered sky above. At the far end of the hall stood Professor Phileas Flitwick, the tiny but formidable charms master, adjusting a strand of tinsel with surgical precision. "Left just a smidge, Mr. Creevey," Flitwick called up toward Colin, who was perched on a ladder. "Perfect. Oh, splendid." It was then that the enormous doors of the great hall creaked open with a groan, revealing a towering figure hunched under the weight of a pine tree so large it scraped the stone archway. "Mornin'," Hagrid's booming voice echoed across the hall. "Brought the last tree, Professor." But this was no ordinary tree. Unlike the others, which stood stately and obedient along the walls of the hall, this one was fidgeting in Hagrid's arms, its lower branches twitching with a life of their own. As Hagrid stumbled forward, the tree gave a violent shake, flinging a handful of snow into the air and nearly knocking over a group of second years. A low growl, unnatural for a plant, rumbled from within the piney depths. "Oh no," muttered Professor McGonagall, from her seat near the staff table, watching the scene unfold. "Is that the one from the Dark Forest?" "Only one I could find that still had all its needles," Hagrid said defensively, setting it upright. The tree stood motionless for a moment, as if contemplating its next move. Then it struck. With a sudden lurch, the tree whipped its branches out in every direction, knocking over tables and sending decorations flying. A string of enchanted bells was yanked from the rafters and slingshotted across the hall. A golden bauble exploded with a pop of magic, releasing a flurry of glitter that clung to students' hair and robes. Lavender Brown shrieked as a garland wrapped itself around her waist, yanking her a full meter into the air. Pandemonium erupted, students scattered, chairs were overturned. A group of fifth years dived behind the Gryffindor table, using dinner platters as shields. Even the ghosts retreated through the walls with surprised expressions, and nearly headless Nick floated by, muttering, "In all my years I've never seen such arboreal aggression." "Everyone out!" McGonagall barked, wand raised. her voice slicing through the chaos. But Flitwick remained. He hadn't moved an inch from his spot near the dais, though his usually cheerful face now bore a look of grim determination. With a flick of his wand, he sent the floating candles out like a gust of wind blowing through the hall, extinguishing the fire hazard. Then, brushing the glitter from his robes, he approached the tree. "Professor, no!" shouted Seamus Finnegan from the doorway, but Flitwick raised a hand for silence. There was something almost regal in the way he stepped forward, part conductor, part warrior, his wand poised like a baton. The tree hissed and cracked, sap oozing from a split branch as it prepared for another attack. Flitwick twirled his wand with a flick that seemed more like choreography than magic. His voice was clear and melodic as he cast the first spell. "Somnus Ramus!" A golden thread of light curled from his wand and wrapped itself gently around one of the larger branches. The branch shuddered, trembled, and then went limp, as if lulled into a gentle sleep. "Incantare tranquillitas," he continued, and this time a shimmering haze drifted over the tree's canopy, like fog settling on a mountain top. The tree groaned, the sound echoing eerily through the hall. "You're doing it, Professor!" cried Hermione, who had poked her head back inside. "Of course he is," Ron muttered. "It's Flitwick." Another wave of the wand and more shimmering ribbons of magic wrapped around the tree. The baubles stopped rattling. The garland slid down quietly, pooling at the base. Slowly, the tree's thrashing ceased. Its branches fell still. It looked, at last, like what it was supposed to be. A tree. A great, majestic fir, decorated, peaceful, and still. The silence that followed was louder than the commotion. Students crept back in cautiously. The broken chairs were righted. A few brave elves from the kitchens peeked out from behind the drapes. Professor Flitwick exhaled, wiping his forehead with a tiny, lace-trimmed handkerchief. "Every year," he said wearily. "It's the same thing." Laughter erupted from the students, even as they began to help restore order. Hagrid, sheepishly nudging a bauble back into place with his pink umbrella, muttered, "Didn't think she'd be that feisty, Professor. Thought she just wanted a walk." Flitwick gave him a look, not unkind, but stern. "Next year, let's avoid trees that growl, shall we?" "It was just a little rumble," Hagrid said defensively. "Besides, I thought it had character." From the staff table, Dumbledore chuckled. "Indeed, Hagrid, but I think next time we'll let Professor Sprout help you choose a more agreeable spruce." As the students returned to their seats and the decorations resumed their slow, magical drift through the air, it was clear that the moment would become one of those Hogwarts legends students would recount for years. The time the Christmas tree went wild and had to be calmed by Flitwick's spellwork. "Always underestimated that one," muttered Fred Weasley, elbowing his brother George. "I reckon he could take down a Hungarian horntail if he had to." "Bet he already has," George whispered back, eyes gleaming. Professor Flitwick, meanwhile, had returned to the garlands. With precise little levitating charms, he began reattaching them to the now docile tree. The lights flickered back to life, casting a soft glow over his silver hair. In the flickering candlelight, he looked older, wiser, but still very much the spark of Christmas at Hogwarts. Later that evening, as snow fell outside and the hall was aglow with festive cheer, a few students lingered around the tree, examining it closely. "Do you think it remembers?" asked Dean Thomas, eyeing the branches warily. "Probably not," said Hermione, brushing a speck of glitter from her shoulder. "Flitwick's charms affect the magical essence. The tree's calmed, not erased." "Still," Neville added, "I think I'll sit on the other side of the hall tomorrow." The tree stood in the centre of it all, glorious and proud adorned with golden stars, velvet ribbons, and orbs that twinkled like miniature moons. And at its base, almost hidden behind a pile of enchanted presents, lay a small card, handwritten in tiny script. To the bravest little tree in the castle, behave this time. That Christmas became one of the most memorable for the students of Hogwarts. Not because of gifts or feasts, but because they had witnessed one of their quietest professors stand against chaos with nothing but grace, intelligence, and a wand. And he had won. In the weeks that followed, whenever students passed by Flitwick in the halls, they greeted him with slightly more reverence. Some even attempted to mimic his charms work in class with newfound enthusiasm. And though he would never admit it, Flitwick walked just a bit taller that winter. His shoes clicked with purpose, and his eyes sparkled beneath bushy brows. Years later, even long after the war, when former students returned for the holidays and looked up at the towering Christmas tree in the Great Hall, they would remember that night. They would recall how a tree had turned wild, how panic had nearly taken hold, and how it was not force or fire that saved the day, but calmness, charm, and an old wizard who knew how to whisper to the wild heart of Christmas itself. Because at Hogwarts, even trees have personalities. And Professor Flitwick, he's the one who knows how to make them sing. Number 25 silently stood up to Umbridge with dignified defiance. The air in classroom was unusually tense that Tuesday morning. Autumn sunlight filtered through the high, arched windows of Hogwarts, casting golden beams across shelves crammed with ancient tomes and dusty magical instruments. Students shuffled into their seats more quietly than usual, whispering as their eyes darted between Professor Phileas Flitwick, the diminutive yet formidable charms master, and the pink-clad figure looming at the back of the room like an over-decorated toad, Dolores Jane Umbridge. She had been observing lessons across the castle for the past fortnight, her clipboard clutched in stubby fingers, eyes narrowed, lips pursed in perpetual disapproval. Most professors grimaced at the sight of her, but none dared to confront her openly. None, that is, except Professor McGonagall, whose biting sarcasm had already become the stuff of whispered legend among students. But today something different was brewing. Today it was Flitwick's turn to be inspected. Despite standing no taller than most students' waists, Professor Flitwick exuded quiet authority. A half-goblin, half-human wizard, he was one of the most skilled charms practitioners in the wizarding world. Students admired his brilliance, his gentle humor, and his unmistakable kindness, but kindness should never be mistaken for weakness. Dolores Umbridge was about to learn this lesson in the most elegant way possible. The class began as it always did, with a light-hearted flick of Flitwick's wand that sent the chalk dancing across the blackboard. Today, my dear fifth years, we shall attempt the Silencio charm, a very useful little spell, if I may say so, though quite difficult to master. His high, squeaky voice carried easily across the room, warmed by enthusiasm. Umbridge cleared her throat, loud and pointed. She had not taken a seat. Instead, she stood stiffly at the rear, her clipboard ready. Flitwick paused for a fraction of a second. Then, ever so slightly, he inclined his head in acknowledgement and resumed. Now, as you may recall, the incantation is straightforward, Silencio. But success depends heavily on the wand movement, an elegant swirl, and a pointed finish. At this, Umbridge took a step forward. Hem, hem! All heads turned. A heavy silence fell as though a jinx had struck the room. I do hope, Professor Flitwick, Umbridge began, smiling with false sweetness, that you can provide the necessary documentation confirming your qualifications to teach this subject. Flitwick blinked. The moment was brief, but those who knew him well could see it. A flicker of insult, quickly masked. He turned to her slowly, his robes swaying like a curtain in a gentle breeze. "My dear Madam Umbridge," he said softly, his voice as calm and crisp as ever, "I can assure you that I have all the necessary certifications, diplomas, and more." He gave a short, formal bow. "In fact, I earned outstanding grades in all my EWTs, followed by advanced studies at the Department of Mystical Charms in Vienna, and later taught at the Institute for Spellcraft in Bruges before being invited to join Hogwarts some 30 years ago." There was a stunned pause. Students sat motionless, captivated. Umbridge, for once, seemed unsure of her footing. "Well," she managed, her smile twitching at the edges, "that may be, but the Ministry has, I am well aware of the Ministry's concerns," Flitwick said gently, but firmly. "However, unless there has been a sudden revision to Hogwarts employment policy that I am unaware of, my credentials remain beyond reproach." It was not what he said that stunned the room. It was how he said it. No anger, no raised voice, no open rebellion. Just calm, confident fact. The room held its breath. Then, like an orchestral movement shifting into a new key, Flitwick turned back to his students. "Now," he said brightly, "who would like to attempt the charm first?" Hermione Granger, ever eager, raised her hand. But all eyes flickered back to Umbridge, who remained frozen, one hand still holding her quill. Her mouth opened, but no words came. After a moment of awkward stillness, she scribbled something onto her parchment and slunk to the back wall, her expression unreadable. Later, Harry would whisper to Ron, "Did you see that? He completely shut her down without even raising his voice." Ron, still grinning, whispered back, "It was bloody brilliant." The students never forgot that lesson, but neither did Umbridge. In the days that followed, something changed. Umbridge continued her rounds, of course, issuing decrees and assigning detentions with malicious glee. But she never again interrupted Professor Flitwick's class. In fact, she seemed to avoid it altogether, choosing instead to focus her attention on what she saw as greater threats like Professor Trelawney and Hagrid. The incident entered Hogwarts lore, retold in common rooms and corridors. "Remember when Flitwick humiliated Umbridge?" they'd say. But Flitwick himself never referred to it again. He continued his lessons with the same enthusiasm, the same infectious joy, as though nothing had happened. But that single moment, that subtle, poised reply, had done more damage to Umbridge's pride than any hex could, because Umbridge thrived on fear, on submission, and Flitwick had offered neither. His response was not only a display of personal dignity, it was an act of quiet defiance in a school being strangled by bureaucracy and cruelty. As Dumbledore once said, "It is our choices, Harry, that show what we truly are." Flitwick chose grace, chose confidence, chose to meet darkness with brilliance. What made the moment so unforgettable was that it felt deeply earned. Flitwick had never needed to boast. His students knew his skill. They saw how he could levitate a feather with a flick, or silence a room with a charm so smooth it felt like music. He didn't need a resume. His classroom was proof enough. But in that moment, when a petty tyrant attempted to undermine him, he revealed the weight of his experience, the scope of his accomplishments. He reminded everyone, including Umbridge, that true power often speaks softly. Perhaps it was even more devastating, because Flitwick had done it all with a smile. Dolores Umbridge, whose rise in the Ministry had been built on manipulation and intimidation, was utterly unprepared for someone like him. She was used to fear, not respect. And that day she was shown the difference. Years later, students who had long graduated still remembered it. When war came to Hogwarts in the Battle of the Seven Potters, and then again in the Battle of Hogwarts, many recalled the professors who had shown courage long before curses began flying, and among them stood Flitwick, tiny in stature, immense in presence. In Harry Potter, and the Order of the Phoenix, the encounter is immortalized in a single, brilliant sentence. Professor Flitwick, the charms teacher, a tiny little wizard who had to stand on a pile of books to see over his desk, told her cheerfully that he had taught at Hogwarts for many years and had all the necessary qualifications, and then turned his back on her. No dramatic spell was cast, no duel was fought. But in that moment, a battle was won. It was a victory not just for Flitwick, but for every student watching, every young witch and wizard who feared that injustice had taken root in the place that was meant to be their home. It was a reminder that strength wears many faces, and that sometimes the smallest among us deliver the most unforgettable lessons. That day, Umbridge learned that not all resistance comes with a wand raised. Some comes with credentials stated quietly, a bow made politely, and a refusal to be diminished. And for a professor who had made a career out of helping others find their magical voice, there was something poetic about silencing a bully without ever needing to shout. Even as the war darkened the halls of Hogwarts, that memory stood like a beacon. A lesson in resilience, a charm of its own kind, and as students faced detentions with blood quills or were forced into silence by decrees, they held on to that moment, because in Flitwick's calm defiance they saw what dignity truly looked like. Not every act of rebellion must come with fire. Sometimes it comes with facts, sometimes it comes with grace, and sometimes it's delivered by a wizard who stands atop a pile of books and towers above all the rest. Number 26 made jokes even during wartime preparations. Of all the professors at Hogwarts, few possessed the quiet, sparkling brilliance of Professor Phileas Flitwick, a master of charms, a former dueling champion, and a man of remarkably small stature. Flitwick stood tall in the hearts of those who knew him. But what truly distinguished him during the darkest days of the Second Wizarding War was not only his magical prowess, but his ability to smile in the face of despair, and more importantly, to make others smile too. The castle was under siege. The Battle of Hogwarts had begun. As Death Eaters gathered outside the ancient walls, professors scrambled to prepare the defences. There was an eerie hush before the storm. And yet, amidst the tension, Flitwick, his wand ready, his eyes bright, turned to a group of students and said with a half-smile, "If the suits of armour decide to greet Voldemort with a hug instead of hexes, please forgive me. I was never trained in polite dueling etiquette." Hermione Granger, always high-strung in times of danger, actually laughed aloud. So did Seamus Finnegan. Even McGonagall allowed herself a rare upward twitch of the mouth. This one line, buried deep in Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, remains a gem of humanity within the horrors of war. It is spoken not in a classroom but on the eve of battle, and its effect is profound. If the suits of armour decide to greet Voldemort with a hug, what an image! A deadly, unforgiving warlord embraced by enchanted iron soldiers in a show of misfired courtesy. In that moment, the tension cracked, even if just slightly, and people breathed again. Flitwick's humour wasn't foolish or frivolous. It wasn't the laugh of a jester seeking attention. It was carefully timed, expertly placed, a charm in itself. He understood something that many did not. Fear is a curse, and laughter can be its counterspell. While others braced themselves with hardened grimaces and clenched jaws, Flitwick brought a twinkle of absurdity into the dread, disrupting Voldemort's reign of terror with something the Dark Lord could never comprehend: lightness. One must remember that Professor Flitwick had witnessed the rise of Voldemort before. He had been there the first time Hogwarts trembled under the threat of darkness. He had seen students disappear, families ruined, names whispered in fear, but even then he had chosen not to let fear steal his dignity or his joy. And in the Second War, when the castle once again became a fortress, Flitwick's cheerful resolve became a weapon of its own. His contribution to the castle's defence was, of course, immense. As the head of Ravenclaw House and Master of Charms, he was in charge of many of the magical fortifications. It was Flitwick who animated the suits of armour to patrol the corridors. It was Flitwick who helped enchant the castle walls, to repel curses and block unauthorized entry. And it was Flitwick who, alongside Professors McGonagall and Sprout, stood at the front lines when the enemy came crashing through the barriers. But behind every enchantment was his voice, small, lively, and full of wit. "Well, if that doesn't hold them off," he remarked once, after casting a complex shield charm across a corridor, "perhaps we can offer them some tea and a polite request to leave." The students laughed again, tired but grateful. In that laughter was something irreplaceable, hope. When Luna Lovegood, his favourite Ravenclaw, appeared to fight alongside her peers, Flitwick's pride was obvious. "Miss Lovegood," he said, slightly breathless, after deflecting a hex, "you continue to surprise me in the best of ways." Even in the chaos of battle, he never lost his ability to see the good in people, to notice the beauty in their bravery. And it was not only students who admired him. Kingsley Shacklebolt, later to become Minister for Magic, once said, "Flitwick's got a quiet kind of strength, the sort that doesn't need shouting or showmanship. He's the kind of man who could disarm a Death Eater with a joke and bind him with a bow." Indeed, Flitwick's sense of timing was legendary, not just in combat, but in conversation. There is a scene often overlooked, not included in the films, when Flitwick duels Yaxley, one of the higher-ranking Death Eaters. The encounter is swift, efficient. With a flick of his wand and a whispered incantation, Yaxley is blasted backward, unconscious, before he can cast a second spell. And after the duel, Flitwick, brushing soot off his sleeves, muttered, "That's what they teach in the advanced dueling clubs, dear boy," before moving on to the next corridor, completely unfazed. To fight with skill is one thing, to fight with kindness, still intact, that is something else entirely. In the Great Hall, as wounded were carried in and spells still echoed off the walls, Flitwick paused to conjure chocolate for a young boy who had fainted from exhaustion. "Best remedy for shock," he said with a wink, "unless you're allergic. In which case I'll find you a biscuit." He was always careful with his words, even during duels. While others shouted hexes and roared incantations, Flitwick's voice was calm, precise, almost musical. His magic was elegant, and so was his humour. His laughter never belittled anyone, it included everyone. It was a kind of warmth in a castle that had grown cold with fear. During the hours of the siege, Professor Flitwick moved through the castle like a guardian sprite, small, fast, and brilliant. He encouraged the students not with orders, but with confidence. "You've got this, Miss Brown, and if you don't, well, run behind me and let me hex their eyebrows off." He even conjured singing shields once, an experimental charm that made the enchanted shields hum lullabies as they repelled curses. "Soothing and effective," he claimed, "unless the Death Eaters appreciate Mozart, in which case we'll need a plan B." And perhaps what made Flitwick so beloved was that his humour came not from detachment, but from deep empathy. He wasn't pretending the war wasn't real, he simply refused to let it turn him into something he wasn't. He had been underestimated all his life, because of his size, his cheerful disposition, his lack of menace, but those who underestimated him did so at their peril. Flitwick could be gentle, but he was never weak. He fought with the heart of a giant. And when the war was over, when the dust had settled and Voldemort had fallen, it was Flitwick who returned to his classroom, dusted off his lectern, and continued teaching young witches and wizards how to make feathers fly and candles dance, as if to say, Joy survives. Magic survives. We survive. In later years, when Hogwarts hosted commemorative events for those lost in the war, Flitwick was often seen standing quietly near the edge of the room, his eyes bright but a little distant. And when students asked him how he managed to stay cheerful during the darkest times, he replied, "Because I had to. If I gave in to fear, what example would I be setting for you?" He was a reminder that not all heroes wear armor or carry swords. Some wield wands with a flourish and make laughter bloom in the middle of a storm. Professor Flitwick didn't just protect Hogwarts with charms, he protected its soul with joy. Even in the face of Voldemort's cruelty, Flitwick remained himself. And that, in the end, was his greatest spell. Wingardium Leviosa, he once told a class, smiling at the memory. A light spell for heavy times. No one forgot that, because they knew that in the hands of Flitwick, even the simplest charm could lift more than just feathers, it could lift spirits. His legacy lives on in every corner of Hogwarts, where laughter once echoed despite the war. In every charms lesson where students are told not just how to cast, but why to cast. In every joke whispered before a duel, every smile exchanged during fear. Professor Flitwick reminded everyone that magic was not just power, it was joy and wonder, and sometimes it was simply saying the right thing at the right time. And so when the Great Hall is quiet and portraits sleep, some say you can still hear the distant echo of his words. Polite dueling is all well and good, until your opponent forgets his manners. Then you remind him gently, with a stupefy. That is how Filius Flitwick fought the war. Not only with spells, but with soul. With cleverness and kindness, and an indestructible spark of humour that even death could not dim. In the grand story of Hogwarts, where many names are etched in stone, his remains one of the most quietly powerful. A tiny man with a giant heart, who taught that laughter could be magic too. Number 27 declined a seat in the Wizengamot to keep teaching. It is often said that power reveals a person's true nature. When offered a seat at the heart of magical Britain's judicial authority, in the Wizengamot, few would have the courage to say no. And yet Filius Flitwick, the diminutive charms master of Hogwarts, did just that. The offer came in the turbulent months following the Second Wizarding War, a time when the Ministry of Magic scrambled to rebuild both its legitimacy and its personnel. In its desperate need to include respected voices from the magical world, the Ministry turned to those whose reputations had remained stainless throughout the conflict. Professor Flitwick, known for his quiet brilliance and unimpeachable integrity, was an obvious candidate. The invitation arrived by owl, sealed with purple wax bearing the crest of the Wizengamot itself. According to accounts from those close to him, the owl landed softly on the charm's classroom windowsill, just as Flitwick was demonstrating the finer points of the Muffliato charm. He excused himself with a gentle bow, broke the seal, and read the parchment silently. Those watching saw a curious mixture of emotions cross his face, surprise, humility, and then something like sadness. He folded the letter neatly and slipped it into his robes. "Class dismissed," he said with unusual quietness. That afternoon he wrote a reply. It was gracious, respectful, and resolute. He declined. To many it seemed an inexplicable decision. The Wizengamot was not just a seat of power, it was the opportunity to shape the very fabric of magical law. It was a place where the likes of Albus Dumbledore had sat, passing judgment and safeguarding the principles of justice. For Flitwick, a decorated duelist, a war hero, and one of the most respected minds at Hogwarts, the seat would have been more than deserved. But to Flitwick, justice wasn't handed down from on high. It was taught, cultivated, and passed on. Student by student, generation after generation. He always believed teaching was a form of politics, said Professor Pomona Sprout, longtime colleague and head of Hufflepuff House. Just not the kind with courtrooms and laws. He believed in shaping minds, in making sure the next generation of witches and wizards had the tools and the character to choose right over wrong. This was not mere idealism. Flitwick had fought in both wizarding wars, stood side by side with Dumbledore's army in the Battle of Hogwarts, and protected students with his own spells as Death Eaters stormed the castle walls. He knew the cost of silence. He knew the cost of inaction. It was this very clarity of purpose that likely made him such an attractive candidate to the ministry. Kingsley Shacklebolt, interim minister at the time, reportedly supported the idea. "We need people like Flitwick," he told Hermione Granger in a closed-door meeting according to her later writings. People who understand what magic should mean, not just what it can do. Shacklebolt's new ministry was desperately trying to avoid the bureaucratic corruption of Cornelius Fudge and the authoritarian darkness of Pius Thickness. They needed moral authority, they needed educators, but Flitwick refused. Those close to him have said that Flitwick's letter of rejection was one of the most gracious the Wizengamot had ever received. In it, he thanked them for the honour, affirmed his belief in the importance of judicial reform, but stated simply and clearly, "I have already chosen my battlefield. The classroom is where the future of the magical world is decided, and I must stand where I am needed most." It was classic Flitwick, modest, clear, unshakable. His decision echoed the quiet dignity with which he had always conducted his life. For decades he had been a fixture in Hogwarts, his high-pitched voice floating down the corridors, his wand flourishing in short bursts of brilliant light. He was often underestimated, both because of his stature and his gentle manner, but there was steel beneath that smile. He had won the International Dueling Championship in his youth, after all, and during the Second Wizarding War, his defensive enchantments protected the school itself. When asked once by a student why he didn't seek promotion or positions of power, Flitwick had smiled and said, "Power is a curious thing, you see. It doesn't always sit comfortably with conscience, and I find that I sleep best when my conscience is untroubled." It wasn't in any book, but it might as well have been one of his personal axioms. He lived by it. In the years following the war, many of his peers accepted high positions. Minerva McGonagall became headmistress, Kingsley became minister. Hermione eventually entered the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. Yet Flitwick remained where he had always been. In his classroom, his tiny figure nearly lost behind stacks of textbooks, surrounded by candles and chalk dust. He continued to teach with undiminished enthusiasm, never seeking applause. His refusal of the Wizengamot seat became something of a legend in itself. Students whispered about it in hallways. Younger teachers told the story in staff rooms. Not all understood it, of course. Some said he was foolish, that his talents were wasted on rowdy students and floating feathers. But others, especially those who had studied under him, knew better. They remembered the way he made even the simplest spell feel like a form of music. They remembered how he spoke about magic as something that should always be tempered by kindness. One such student was Luna Lovegood. In a post-war interview with the Quibbler, she described Flitwick as the most enchanting teacher at Hogwarts. And I mean that in both senses. She added, "He once told me that the most dangerous spell isn't the killing curse. It's the spell that makes you forget that other people matter. He never taught that one." The truth is, Flitwick had always been political, just not in the way the ministry understood. He taught goblin history alongside charms, often referencing the fraught relationship between wizarding kind and goblins. His lectures gently challenged the narrative taught in most wizarding households, and he encouraged students to read alternate sources. He often said, "Understanding those we fear is the first step toward real peace." Indeed, Flitwick's own heritage had once made him the subject of prejudice. Being of partial goblin descent, he had faced skepticism and even mockery in his early years. Yet he had risen through merit alone, earning a professorship at Hogwarts, winning dueling titles, becoming one of the most beloved teachers in the school's history. His very presence in the castle was a quiet rebuke to blood purity. His teachings, his empathy, and his refusal to bow to power made him a symbol, though he never sought to be one. One of the most poignant examples of his impact came during the memorial service for the Battle of Hogwarts. While others gave long speeches, Flitwick stepped forward and simply said, "We lost much, but what we learned must not be lost as well. Teach it, live it, let that be how we honor them." The silence that followed was louder than any applause. Even decades later, his students would recall moments of quiet wisdom. How he placed a steadying hand on a nervous first year's shoulder, how he encouraged creativity in spell work rather than mere replication. He understood that magic was more than power, it was expression, it was responsibility. That belief, more than anything, explained why he turned down the Wizengamot. In a world where many chased titles, Flitwick chose meaning. Perhaps the best summation of his philosophy came during an impromptu conversation with Harry Potter himself. Years after the war, when Harry returned to Hogwarts to give a guest lecture on defense against the dark arts, he had tea with his old charms teacher. According to Harry's personal journal, Flitwick told him, "The world doesn't need more rulers, Harry. It needs more guides, more lantern-bearers in the dark." In turning down the Wizengamot seat, Flitwick wasn't abandoning responsibility. He was embracing the version of it that he believed mattered most, the long, quiet shaping of hearts and minds. His was a revolution of gentleness, of persistent truth, of light cast not from thrones but from classrooms. No plaque bears his name in the Wizengamot Hall, no portrait hangs in the ministry, but in the thousands of students who learn to levitate feathers, cast protective charms, or, more importantly, treat others with respect. Flitwick's legacy is immortal. Every time a young witch or wizard raises a wand, not in anger but in hope, that is his true verdict. Even today, long after he has retired, the charms classroom at Hogwarts remains largely untouched. His notes still hover in the margins of the chalkboard. His desk is still the smallest, yet somehow still feels like the most commanding. And every year, on the anniversary of the Battle of Hogwarts, a group of students, many of whom never met him, place a single feather at his old desk. No one tells them to do it, they just know. Because some judges do not wear robes of power, they wear robes of learning, and sometimes the greatest justice is done not in courts, but in the quiet conviction of a teacher who chose the path of humility over the lure of influence. Professor Phileas Flitwick may have declined the Wizengamot, but in doing so he gave the wizarding world something far rarer, a lesson in honor. Number 28 created magical music spells for Hogwarts concerts. It was a particularly crisp December evening when the great hall of Hogwarts shone in all its glory, filled with golden lights and garlands enchanted to twinkle in rhythm with the music. At the far end of the hall, beneath a floating banner depicting a silver harp crossed with a wand, stood an orchestra without musicians. Every student, from first-year Hufflepuffs to seventh-year Ravenclaws, had their eyes fixed on the stage. Violins hovered gracefully in the air, bows gliding across strings with perfect precision. Flutes twisted gently in mid-air, their notes lilting like birdsong. Drums thumped in solemn harmony, their skins tightening and loosening by some invisible hand. The music was real, full-bodied and flawless. And yet, no one touched the instruments. No one played them. No one save one tiny man with a baton-sized wand and a twinkle in his eye, Professor Phileas Flitwick. Not many students gave it much thought after the dance. Music had always been a part of Hogwarts traditions, hadn't it? Surely the instruments had always played themselves, right? But those who truly knew Hogwarts, those who studied the intricate weavings of magic and its interaction with the arts, knew that what they had witnessed was not a mere display of ordinary spells. It was magic of an entirely new category, conducted and composed by none other than the charms master himself. Professor Flitwick had long nurtured a passion for music. Before he became known for his expertise in charms, before he stood on stacks of books to be seen behind a podium, he had been a musician, a prodigy, in fact, on the harpsichord. As a young student at Hogwarts, Phileas spent countless hours in the deserted music room on the 3rd floor, fingers dancing across ivory keys, his wand resting beside him. But he soon realized a limitation. There were simply not enough students who shared his love or who had any talent for playing. "It's a tragedy," he once told Madame Pomfrey during a quiet afternoon in the hospital wing. "Music has such power, such magic, and yet we let it fall silent for lack of hands." In his 7th year, Phileas began working on a spell he called Sonorus Anima, Latin for sound with soul. It wasn't just a charm to levitate instruments or strike strings. It was a deeply complex enchantment that animated musical tools to react emotionally to a conductor's wand. It required layers of spellcraft, basic levitation, tonal modulation, even a touch of legilimency to imbue the instruments with awareness of rhythm and harmony. He failed more than once. Early prototypes led to a violin shrieking with the voice of a banshee and a flute that tried to fly out the window. Years later, after becoming Hogwarts charms professor, Flitwick revisited the project in earnest. He pored over ancient texts, consulted with goblin harmonists. "Their percussive sensibilities are unmatched," he once claimed, and even corresponded with retired conductor Octavius Merck from the Wizengamot Philharmonic. The breakthrough came during a lonely evening in his office. He had been reading a treatise on magical resonance by Halcyon Rynn when he accidentally knocked his wand against a quill jar in frustration. The impact created a chiming tone, and to his astonishment, the feather quill lifted and danced in the air. Flitwick froze. He repeated the movement. Again the quill responded, not with flight, but with music. It was clumsy and awkward, but unmistakably melodic. He refined the spell obsessively, building layers like a composer writing a symphony. The final form required a conductor, someone to guide the instruments, give them purpose, but the performers themselves. They could be enchanted and awakened, allowed to sing without ever being touched. The key was intent. The conductor's emotions channeled through the wand determined the phrasing, the tempo, the rise and fall of the music. When Flitwick presented his completed spell to Headmaster Dumbledore, the old wizard smiled with true delight. "Ah, Phileas," he said, adjusting his half-moon spectacles, "you've created a bridge between two worlds, sorcery and sonata. Magnificent." The first performance using the Sonorus Anima spell took place during the Yule Ball of 1971. Rumours still circulate that Dumbledore wept openly when a ghostly cello performed a mournful solo reminiscent of a lost love. The instruments danced in the air, weaving among floating candles. The students were stunned. Even the Slytherins clapped. Minerva McGonagall, ever the skeptic of non-traditional magic, admitted afterward, "I was ready to criticize it as frivolous, but when that horn section swelled during the waltz, well, let's just say I nearly stood up and danced with Severus." Interestingly, Flitwick's enchanted orchestras weren't just limited to Hogwarts. In 1985, when a flu outbreak cancelled all Hogsmeade trips for a month, Flitwick organised a spontaneous common room concert in each house using his enchanted instruments. The Gryffindors cheered, the Hufflepuffs cried, the Ravenclaws analysed the counterpoint, and even the Slytherins, despite pretending to be annoyed, requested a second performance, privately. "I saw Draco Malfoy humming along to a ghostly violin once," Ginny Weasley confessed years later. "He turned bright red when he noticed I saw him. But he didn't stop." What made the charm so enduring was its capacity to interpret emotion. If a conductor waved their wand with joy, the instruments played bright and lively. If sorrow guided the gesture, the notes turned somber. Hermione Granger once described it as musical empathy, comparing it to a magical pensive of sound. During a sixth-year Charms elective, she herself conducted a rendition of the Tales of Beedle the Bard through enchanted flutes and celestas. Harry said it sounded like stars falling onto velvet. The enchanted instruments weren't immune to mischief. Fred and George Weasley once charmed a trumpet to blare the Weird Sisters' greatest hits in the middle of Professor Binns' lecture. It earned them a week of detentions, cleaning the orchestra instruments with a toothbrush, but they claimed it was worth it. Flitwick's spell work became so renowned that the Department of Magical Culture requested he publish it in the Wizarding Arts Review. He did, under the title Conducting the Invisible, Enchanting the Silent Orchestra. The spell required not only precise wand work, but also a musical score to be memorized in full, a safety measure Flitwick built in, ensuring no one could wield it without passion for the art. Among those who trained under him in this craft was a young Hufflepuff named Elidora Tinks, who later became conductor of the Magical Symphony of Dublin. "He didn't just teach us how to wave a wand," she once said. "He taught us to feel the sound before we called it into being." One of the most legendary uses of the sonorous anima spell occurred during the memorial for Cedric Diggory. The enchanted instruments, guided by Flitwick himself, played a solemn elegy under the open sky. No one sang, no one needed to. The music carried every student's grief into the night, a lament shaped by every flick of Flitwick's hand. Even now, the music room on the third floor holds his prototype instruments. They hang silently from the ceiling, like bats in hibernation. But when the moon is high and the castle is quiet, some students say they hear faint melodies echoing through the corridors. Ron Weasley once told Luna Lovegood, "It's probably Peeves." But Luna simply replied, "No, it's the instruments remembering joy." Though the sonorous anima spell is considered advanced magic, Flitwick occasionally teaches it to top students. It has become something of a rite of passage for seventh-year Charms pupils. Those who master it are invited to conduct a small concert in the courtyard garden during spring, an event known as the Invisible Sonata. Only a handful succeed each decade. Neville Longbottom, surprisingly, was one of them. "I was nervous," he confessed. "But when I imagined my mum humming lullabies to me, the music just came. It wasn't perfect, but Professor Flitwick said it had heart." Even decades after his retirement, Professor Flitwick's enchantment continues to breathe life into Hogwarts festivities. At every Christmas feast, the enchanted orchestra plays the carols. At every leaving feast, the instruments perform a hopeful march. And whenever a young witch or wizard watches in awe as the instruments dance without hands, a little spark is lit, the same spark Phileas Flitwick once felt all those years ago in the third-floor music room. Some say that one day the spell will become part of the standard Hogwarts curriculum. Others insist it's far too delicate for mass instruction. But everyone agrees on one thing: no celebration at Hogwarts feels complete without the enchanted orchestra, and the tiny conductor who taught music how to fly. As Flitwick once told Harry Potter during a quiet chat after a DA meeting, magic is about more than defense and duels, Harry. It's about beauty, about making something from nothing. And when music floats through the air, unplayed but alive, that's as close to pure magic as we ever get. And so the music plays on. Number 29 wore a top hat on festive occasions. On the night of the Yule Ball in Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, the great hall shimmered with snowflake charms and silver frost, candlelight reflecting off the enchanted ice sculptures. Students poured in, dressed in their finest robes, eyes wide at the transformation of their school. Among the throng of glittering robes and curious Muggle-style tuxedos stood a figure who, despite his short stature, commanded instant attention. Professor Phileas Flitwick, the charms master of Hogwarts, had once again outdone himself, not with a spell but with his impeccable fashion sense. Clad in a rich velvet frock coat that brushed the tops of his polished boots and a tall, perfectly balanced black top hat, Flitwick radiated elegance and old-world charm. The description of Flitwick's attire is not incidental. J.K. Rowling, with her talent for detail, makes special mention of the professor's distinctive appearance at formal events. In Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, when Harry arrives at the Yule Ball, the narration reads, Professor Flitwick was now dancing with Madame Maxime. He looked like a doll clinging to her waist as she glided around with surprising grace in spite of her size. Flitwick was wearing a very old-fashioned suit with a high collar and, most curiously, a top hat that wobbled with every step. That top hat, an iconic piece of his wardrobe, wasn't merely a fashion statement, it was a reflection of the man himself, dignified, whimsical, and delightfully unexpected. Flitwick's cylinder hat, the formal top hat associated with 19th century elegance, symbolized more than style. It was a nod to his background, a subtle gesture that hinted at his mixed heritage of wizard and goblin ancestry. While many might have hidden or downplayed such lineage, Flitwick seemed to embrace it with flair. His carefully selected formal wear, complete with traditional accessories, helped him stand taller, figuratively and literally, in a world where height and bloodline could easily define perception. At the Christmas feast in Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, the atmosphere is festive, almost dreamlike, with 12 towering Christmas trees, enchanted snow falling indoors, and 1,000 golden bubbles floating overhead. It is here, too, that Flitwick is described as beaming, enjoying the merriment like a child at a carnival. Though no detailed clothing description is given in that scene, it becomes a known pattern. Whenever there's a special occasion, Professor Flitwick is impeccably dressed, bringing a Victorian sense of splendor to Hogwarts' whimsical chaos. Students across all 4 houses adored him not just for his talent. After all, he was the wizard who had mastered the levitation charm, Wingardium Leviosa, but for his cheerful demeanor and delightful presentation. Parvati Patil once commented during her 4th year that Professor Flitwick looked like he'd stepped out of a magical painting. And indeed he did. With his silver-streaked hair neatly parted and waistcoat glinting with enchanted buttons, Flitwick could have passed for a character from a ballroom portrait at the Ministry of Magic. His top hat was not reserved exclusively for balls and feasts. At award ceremonies and dueling demonstrations, too, he would don the hat, always straight-backed, polished, and proud. When he presided over the dueling club in Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, standing beside the ever-dramatic Gilderoy Lockhart, he wore a formal teaching robe that shimmered slightly at the sleeves and a pointed hat adorned with stars. Yet for school-wide celebrations, he always returned to the top hat. It became his signature, a detail so small yet so vivid that many alumni still remember him by it. Hermione Granger once remarked in passing, during a conversation with Luna Lovegood and Neville Longbottom in their 6th year, that she thought Flitwick's festive attire made him look like a conductor of some magical orchestra. It's an apt comparison. Just as a conductor brings harmony to music, Flitwick brought order and delight to Hogwarts events. His hat, always slightly wobbly on his head, was like the baton of a master magician orchestrating spells, laughter, and goodwill. Though small in stature, Flitwick never went unnoticed. On the contrary, his presence at school feasts was eagerly anticipated. Fred and George Weasley, known for their mischief and irreverence, once enchanted their butterbeers to raise a toast in unison when Flitwick entered the room during the end-of-term celebration in their 5th year. "To the sharpest dresser in the castle," George had declared, earning laughs and applause, and even a bashful bow from the professor himself. Flitwick's sense of style wasn't accidental. He was known among the staff to take pride in his appearance, especially when it came to magical gatherings. Professor Sprout once joked during a staff meeting, "When Phileas shows up in that hat, you know it's going to be a real party." It was said that Flitwick even had the hat charmed with an enchantment to remain perfectly upright, no matter how energetically he moved, a necessity considering his animated nature during celebrations. The symbolism of the top hat, especially in the wizarding world, cannot be overlooked. It harkens back to an era when wizards walked among muggles with a little more subtlety, their identities hinted at only by their choice of accessory or an oddly shimmering cloak. By keeping this tradition alive, Flitwick was preserving not just fashion, but magical history itself. His look reminded Hogwarts students of the time when elegance and magic went hand in hand. There's also a certain theatricality to Flitwick's attire. As the conductor of the school choir, remember the frogs croaking bass notes at Christmas? He often brought a performative flair to his teaching and extracurricular activities. He would raise his wand like a baton, tap it twice, and the voices would rise in chorus, harmonized by magic and melody. One cannot help but imagine him adjusting his hat just before beginning, like a maestro preparing for a masterpiece. In Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince during Dumbledore's funeral, we see another side of Flitwick, solemn, still dignified, but stripped of the festive colours. His robes were dark, simple, yet impeccably pressed. The hat was absent that day. It made the moment even more poignant, as though the absence of his signature accessory conveyed the weight of the occasion. Students noticed even the smallest change in Flitwick's appearance spoke volumes, for he was not a man of excess, but of deliberate expression. Rumours among younger Ravenclaws claimed that Flitwick owned not one, but 7 different top hats, each enchanted for a different purpose. One would keep warm in snow, another repel butterbeer spills, and one was rumoured to glow gently in the dark like a lantern. While these stories were likely exaggerations, they capture the way Flitwick's fashion became part of Hogwarts lore, a kind of magical myth all its own. What made Flitwick's style so endearing was its contrast with his personality. He was soft-spoken, humble, and rarely sought the spotlight. But when he stepped into the great hall in his full regalia, all eyes turned toward him. It was not arrogance. It was a celebration of joy, magic, and personal expression. Like his charms, it was subtle and powerful all at once. His love of classical elegance also served as a silent lesson to students. Dignity comes in many forms. For young witches and wizards growing into their identities, Flitwick was more than just a professor of spells. He was a model of confidence and self-respect. It wasn't about following trends, it was about knowing who you are and dressing accordingly. A valuable lesson quietly taught through silk lapels and a perfectly tilted hat. At the annual staff Christmas party, held in the room of requirement when the students had all gone home, Flitwick was always the first to arrive, and always, without fail, in his formal black and green frock coat and matching top hat with a single silver feather tucked in the brim. Minerva McGonagall, never one for excessive fashion, often teased him. "You're only making the rest of us look lazy, Phileas." To which he would reply with a twinkle in his eye, "A little elegance never hurt a celebration." The portraits of past headmasters in Dumbledore's office often watched Flitwick with admiration during ceremonies. Phineas Nigellus Black, despite his acerbic wit, once muttered approvingly, "Now there's a wizard who understands presentation." It was one of the few compliments he ever paid. Even after the Battle of Hogwarts, when the castle lay in partial ruin and the future seemed uncertain, Flitwick was seen helping rebuild, not with his formal wear, of course, but with rolled-up sleeves and quick wand work. And yet during the memorial feast held in honour of the fallen, there he was once again, wearing his hat, now with a single white flower at its band, honouring not just the dead, but life itself. Professor Flitwick's cylinder hat is more than a curious detail. It is a symbol of who he is, a fusion of magic, dignity, tradition, and delight. In a world filled with wands, dragons, and dark lords, it's easy to overlook the quiet elegance of a well-dressed charms master. But those who studied under him, who danced beside him, or simply admired him from afar, would never forget the way he stood beneath the floating candles, top hat gleaming, adding just a bit more magic to an already enchanted world.